Welcome to all of you who've joined us this evening in London, this afternoon in Washington, New York, I'm imagining from other places around the world. I'm Leslie Binjamore, direct the U.S. and Americas program here at Chatham House. It is a pleasure, it is an honor, and I have to say, I think it's not only one of the most consequential questions for America and its role in the world, it's also one of the most intellectually fascinating and analytically interesting questions, I think, that is on the table right now. That is the future of the Republican Party. And what a time to have the conversation only weeks away from the US election having been decided. We have a sitting US president who has not yet officially accepted the results. The transition has now begun, but of course, it remains a very deeply troubled time on one level for America's democracy, because so many leading members of the Republican Party have not formally come out and accepted the result of the election. Nonetheless, I think we feel very much ready to have this discussion, and it's difficult to imagine two better people to have it with. They will both be very familiar to you for their policy work, for their publications, for their leadership roles in the think tank and university sector. And they also have spent a lot of time actually in the UK, either full-time in the case of Shockey or by traveling to give talks, as is the case with Matthew Kroenig. I also consider them both friends. So for me, this is really quite an honor, and I'm grateful for them taking the time. I'm going to introduce them very briefly and say a few words about our topic and then turn over to Corey. I should say that tonight's public roundtable is on the record. It is being recorded and it will be shared. So it's terrific. It will be great to hear your questions. And it's also an opportunity for you to be in dialogue with our panelists and to go back and listen again, which I have to say I've continued to do with our roundtables that we've had over the past several months. You learn a lot on the second and third time listening to what people like this have to say, because there are a lot of layers underneath it. Corey Shockey is currently Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. I say currently because she was previously the Deputy Director at the IISS, and we loved having Corey in London. If you were going to move to Washington, I'm glad that you did it when we couldn't really get together in person anyway, and not sooner. She has held leading positions in government, in the State Department, and the Defense Department, on the National Security Council. She has taught at Stanford and West Point and many other places, King's College London. And she's also very well published. One of her most recent books, the one that I like to mention, is Safe Passage: The Transition from British to American Hegemony. And she also just very recently co-authored a very important piece in Foreign Affairs, in which she really made the case against America going it alone and for America's engagement in alliances. I think it's fair to say that it's well known that Corey Shockey is known as being a never Trump Republican. She could correct me if she wishes, but I think that is a label that's been perhaps self-adopted and also widely applied. Professor Matthew Kroenig is a professor in the Department of Government and the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, a very distinguished and influential one. He is also the Deputy Director at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and has worked in government, in the Defense Department, and in intelligence in various roles. His latest book, The Return of Great Power Rivalry, Democracy versus Autocracy, From the Ancient World to the US and China. So clearly very relevant to today's debates. However, rather than bringing these two distinguished scholars and policy thought leaders on to talk specifically about the US or China or Iran or defense, topics that they're very well known for talking about, I really wanted to get their thoughts on the future of the Republican Party, because we all know that this is where the real question lies for the future of America. We saw that well over 70 million Americans have voted for Donald Trump. We have heard the line that Trumpism will remain long after Donald Trump. We don't really know exactly what that means. We've heard that there is a bipartisan consensus on some key aspects of US foreign policy, but at the same time, we get the impression as we watch that a President Biden after January 20th might not be able to get anything through the Senate, depending on what happens in Georgia in January 5th. We understand also that it's hard to imagine a more important time in America's role in the world for there to be bipartisanship and also to restore and rebuild and repair the relations between those Americans who identify as Republicans or Democrats across every single level of the country. So these are really significant questions. I think we're very far from having an answer, but we're certainly hoping that you will illuminate and also guide us and perhaps give us some advice on the direction of travel for the future of the Republican Party. So with that said, Kori Shockey, you're on the record, and I turn it over to you to begin.
Thank you, my friend. And Leslie, thank you for your leadership, both of the Americas program and also at Chatham House. It really matters, and I'm a huge consumer of the work your team produces, so thank you for that. The future of the Republican Party. Yeah. The founder of the American public school system once said that education is our only political safety. Outside of this ark, all is deluge. And I think about that all the time right now when I think about the future of my beloved Republican Party, because we are having an enormous civil war within the Republican Party and within the conservative movement that I think Leslie's right. It matters what the outcome is of this. And Leslie's also right, excuse me, that I am a serenely unrepentant opponent of President Trump. I was in 2016, I was in 2020. And the reasons are partly policy, but mostly domestic policy. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. There are lots of things President Trump didn't understand about the world and wasn't curious about the world. But Leslie's already made the most important point, which is 74 million Americans, after seeing 4 years of Donald Trump's leadership, voted for his reelection. And there is a tendency, particularly among the left wing of the Democratic Party, to suggest that anyone who supported President Trump is a virulent racist or, doesn't believe women should be in the workplace or doesn't support democracy in America. And that self-satisfying condescension is actually part of how we got to President Trump at the head of the Republican Party. Because it is certainly true that there are racists and misogynists among the president's supporters. But I just think it's statistically unlikely that 74 million Americans fit that description, and that we have a responsibility, whether as supporters or opponents of conservative principles and practices, to figure out why they're actually voting for him. And some of the more interesting outcomes from this presidential election, I think, give pause to that potential narrative. So 25% of Black men under the age of 30 voted for President Trump. A full third of Latinos voted for President Trump. Republicans carried every congressional district along the Mexican border in Texas, despite how terrible President Trump's commentary about Mexican immigrants to the United States has been. 40% of white women voted for President Trump. So there's actually a lot going on there that merits breaking down. My theory of the case is that what people liked about President Trump, what his genuine political brilliance has been, is giving voice to things that people think, but politicians hadn't been saying. So why don't allies do more for their own defense? Doesn't free trade export American jobs and create downward pressure on wages? And isn't immigration out of hand if we have no control over our southern border? If people like me were doing our jobs better, my mom would actually know the answer to those questions, but she doesn't, and she voted for President Trump, despite having 2 daughters ardently attempting to persuade her otherwise. And so I think you actually have to take both the failure of conservative elites to bring our own voters along to the conservative policies that we favor, but also the president's genius in asking questions that we hadn't given adequate answers to. Reconnecting the elite and the public conversations is a big part of what we're fighting about in the Republican Party right now. I also think that there is a sloppy assumption that ethnic or religious minorities are natural progressives, and that's certainly not true for Latinos, who tend to be small business owners, who tend to oppose bilingual education. In California, we just had on the ballot this time, again, an attempt to reestablish bilingual education in our schools. And it failed because Latino parents mobilized against it. So people are more interesting and complicated than simple labels give them. And addressing that diversity of identities is, I think, a big part of what Republicans can do to honor the diversity of America and consolidate the gains that the president showed with those groups. A couple of other things, though. We are losing young Americans by a landslide. And the complacency that many Republicans have that, once these kids start paying taxes and are responsible for stuff, they'll become sensible conservatives. There's actually no data that shows that dynamic works. That in fact, people's political, their party preferences tend to be set in their 20s, and they tend to be set by the events people experience when they're 20s. One of the most interesting things that came out of the research that Jim Mattis and I did for our book on civil-military relations, Warriors and Citizens, was to realize, anomalous in the data, that the attitudes of people under 25 most closely approximated the attitudes of people who had lived through the Great Depression and World War II. They didn't believe peace was reliable. They didn't believe the economy was going to serve them. And those under 25-year-olds are the young voters who have abandoned the Republican Party. One more thing I would say about the Republican Civil War, which is it merits remembering that Republicans have been an enormously destructive force this election by calling into doubt the legitimacy of the electoral process and the electoral outcome. That's obvious. What merits noting is that it's also Republicans who ensured the integrity of this election and defended it against challenges from their fellow Republicans. The secretaries of state in Georgia, in Arizona, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and the transparent process that they ran are what has discredited the claims of the president and his supporters. They are 1 for 39 in court challenges, but it's even actually more important that the vituperativeness with which they are continuing to contest an outcome that the Democratic candidate won by 7 million votes is what I believe will discredit President Trump's desire for being reelected in 2024 and being a major leader of the party. Those Republicans who supported President Trump because of tax cuts and judges are likely to find another candidate who will produce tax cuts and judges and doesn't call into question the integrity of democracy in America, doesn't prove himself a challenge to constitutional governance. So who are those people? Well, the contenders, the self-appointed contenders, what our British friends know and everyone rightly lives in terror of is that the American political system is so wide open, any idiot can get elected president and very often does, that you can catapult to the top of a party even by not being a member of that party, as Bernie Sanders showed, and as Donald Trump and Michael Bloomberg and others switching their party affiliation for better opportunity demonstrate. The people who think they're contenders, Senator Tom Cotton, Senator Josh Hawley, former UN ambassador and Governor Nikki Haley, have taken very strident lines on international policy, not that much different from President Trump's, right? Sharp-edged America first, a belief that allies have no better choice than to do what we tell them to do, and to be belligerent towards Iran and other countries. All three of those positions are actually wildly out of step with where the American public is, as the Chicago Council on Global Affairs polling shows. And it's even out of step with where Republicans are. As a result, I don't think that's going to be the winning hand that any of those three believe it will be, even if Donald Trump remains salient in the Republican constellation. My guess is that the challenges the country's facing, most importantly the pandemic, are going to strengthen the viability of governors as potential presidential candidates, because so many of the challenges are actually domestic. And strengthening the sources of American domestic vitality is probably the best way to manage competition with a rising China, a declining Russia, and building a common approach among America's friends. And I'll stop there, Leslie.
Thank you. That was great, Corey. I'm going to ask you one quick question before we turn to Professor Matthew Kroenig. What is your best guess once Donald Trump has left the White House on January 20th? What is your best guess on what happens to those in the Senate who have so strongly supported him to the extent of not even recognizing the outcome of the election yet? So the Mitch McConnells of the world. Not that there is more than one Mitch McConnell, but where do you see that part of the Republican Party going? Will they play ball, or will it be as bad as it looks like it could be?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer. Let me tell you the arguments on both sides. The argument that they will not cooperate is that the lack of cooperation with a Democratic chief executive predates Joe Biden's tenure, right? Mitch McConnell famously said in 2012, that his top priority was preventing Barack Obama from being able to do anything. And he did. But one of the things that has actually hurt the Republican Party, cost us a lot of Republicans who are now independents, and cost us a lot of support among young conservatives, is the sense that we only play by the rules when they favor conservative outcomes. The treatment of Judge Merrick Garland's nomination was not only a disgrace for Republicans, but it creates a sense that every election is existential, right? And that's fundamentally un-American, but it's also fundamentally unconservative. We're the people who follow the rules, who think rules matter. And you can see the atrophying of the appeal of conservatism, especially to young people, tracking alongside a belief, not that they don't share our values, that they think we don't actually share our values. My sense is that the reason that Republicans outperformed the president by a significant margin on the ticket is that there is lingering concern among conservatives about what Democratic control of both the Congress and the White House would produce. I don't think that necessarily means that they won't play ball, because I think the argument on the other side of the line, which I find more persuasive, is that Americans are weary of the daily knife fight of political combat, and they actually want people to get something done. As you know, the American political system is designed to do nothing unless you can get wide agreement on what to do. And I think that's what people are yearning for. And I had a conversation a few years ago with Mac Thornberry, Republican member of the House of Representatives, whose district is the most Republican of any district in the country. And yet he did not endorse Donald Trump either in 2016 or 2020. When I asked him how big a problem that was for him, he said that he thought a lot of the support among his voters for President Trump was a desire, was a aggravation that Washington's not getting anything done. It's not solving any problems, and they want problems solved. And that, I think, is the argument that other Republicans are likely to be hearing and likely to respond to. And it's likely going to get you an infrastructure bill. It's likely going to get you healthcare. It's likely going to get you a lot of things that in a pandemic, all of us are realizing we have undervalued.
Thank you. And thank you for finishing this part of your remarks on that very optimistic note. I hope that you're right. Matthew Kroenig, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's really a pleasure to speak at Chatham House and to be speaking with my old friends and colleagues, Leslie and Corey. And I'm happy to be having this discussion because usually I think more about policy and less about partisan politics. So it was good for me to collect my ideas on this subject. And in my opening remarks, I wanted to address the question that you raised at the beginning, Leslie, which is Trumpism here to stay? Is there Trumpism after Trump? I think I'm going to argue essentially that I think there's good reason to believe that it won't be here to stay, that we will see a return to a more traditional Republican foreign policy. And I say that for three reasons. And the first one is one I think that maybe Corey will disagree with me on, so maybe we can have a discussion about this and the discussion period. But I think that actually Trump was more traditional conservative in some of his foreign policies than many appreciate. Now, don't get me wrong, there was a lot that was different and disruptive. The style, the tweeting, I think really lack of understanding of the world and America's role in the world and the importance of allies. His poor management of the bureaucracy, hiring and firing people, the loyalty tests. And then on policy, I think there were things that were very different too, picking trade wars with allies, berating allies. So there was a lot that was different, and I don't want to downplay that. But I think there are a lot of things that people had thought of as Trumpism that I think we would have seen if Marco Rubio or somebody like that had won in 2016. And I did work on campaigns for both Scott Walker, and then when he, governor of Wisconsin, and then when he dropped out, worked for Rubio in 2016. So the opposition to the Iran deal, that was something that all the Republican candidates in 2016 agreed on. Rubio and Walker said they would tear it up on day one. So I think it's very likely you would have seen any Republican president pull out of the Iran deal. Increasing the defense budget, nuclear modernization, the two new low-yield nuclear weapons, strengthening missile defense. I think those are things you would have seen with a lot of any really Republican president. Getting out of the INF treaty. I think some people attributed this as Trump pulling away from international agreements. but I think a lot of Republican politicians would have gotten out of that treaty once Russia was cheating. The willingness to go it alone, go unilateral if necessary. We saw that in the Bush administration as well. So don't want to overplay this point, but I think there was still a lot of kind of conservative international tendencies even in the Trump administration. And a lot of the people in the administration were more conservative internationalists. And I think we saw their influence weaken probably over the course of the term. But the so-called adults in the room keeping things on a fairly steady course. So that's point number one. I think Trump was less populist and Trumpist in his foreign policy than maybe some believe. Second, and I think this does echo something that Corey said, is that I don't think Republican voters were really voting for Trump's foreign policy. The 70 million or 74 million votes, I think that wasn't about Trump's foreign policy. I don't think it was about racism or sexism either. I agree with Corey on that. But a colleague of mine, Matt Grossman, he's a political science professor at Michigan. Well, I guess let me back up. Political scientists have known for some time that Americans don't vote on foreign policy. They vote on the economy. They vote more on kitchen table issues. They're not paying attention to NATO or trade deals or things like that. And that really makes sense. They know they're not experts on foreign policy. Just like I know I'm not an expert on how to repair my car, so I don't study, don't read a lot of articles on how to repair my car. I just trust experts to take care of it. So my colleague, Matt Grossman, said that, in the late stages of the campaign, if you look at the Republican advertisements, they were really focused on traditional Republican things: tax cuts, the economy, Supreme Court appointments, not getting tough on NATO, or not race or sex issues. I think we did see a shift in opinions among Republican voters, but American political scientists have studied this as well. And again, since people aren't that informed on foreign policy, they tend to follow the cues of elites and of their party leaders. And so when you have somebody like President Trump as the head of the Republican Party saying that, Russia's not that bad, you did see American Republican opinions of Russia improve. I don't think that's due to an underlying really strong beliefs about NATO being bad or Russia being good. I think it is about voters not being that informed, following the cues of their leaders. And so I think it is likely that if we have a Nikki Haley or Marco Rubio in 2024 saying Russia's a problem, we need to be good to our allies, I think we'd see Republican voters' opinions on those things flip. And just, some personal anecdotes. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. Most of my loved ones, friends and family in Missouri voted for President Trump, and Missouri went for President Trump in 2016 and 2020 by pretty safe margins. My friends and family don't follow NATO closely. They don't follow trade or immigration closely. The things they liked about Trump, they said that he liked that he was good for the economy. The stock market was doing well. Taxes were low. To what Corey said, they kind of liked this idea that he was saying things that others wouldn't say. I think they were wrong about this, but there was this sense that he was authentic, really saying what was coming to his mind rather than talking points. That's point number two. I don't think Republican voters were supporting Trump due to his foreign policy. I think it was due to these other things. Final point is that I think Trumpism does require Trump. It's hard for me to see somebody picking up this mantle and running with it. And I think Trump is somewhat sui generis. If you go back to the 1990s, almost every rap song had some reference to President Trump as somebody to aspire to, the kind of example of wealth and success. He was had this television show that was very popular that I think, again, for many Americans, he was the example of wealth and success. And so it's very hard for me to see somebody pulling off what he did. If somebody tried to pick up that mantle and be President Trump, I think it's very hard to fake. And if you look at the people who are likely to run in 2024, and Corey mentioned a lot of them: Nikki Haley, former UN ambassador, Mike Pompeo, I think will likely run, the current Secretary of State, Mike Pence, the current Vice President, Tom Cotton, senator from Arkansas. I think Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, would likely run again. I think Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas, might run again. Josh Hawley, a senator from Missouri, Ron DeSantis, a governor from Florida. Those are some of the ones I think are most likely. There will probably be others. But if you look at those people's views, and again, maybe Corey and I have a slightly different interpretation here, but I think almost all of these people are more conservative internationalists than they are Trumpist populists. I think maybe with the exception of Hawley and Ted Cruz, that I do think have more populist views than some of the others. But some of my evidence for this was the vice presidential debate. And I don't know if you watched the vice presidential debate between Mike Pence and Kamala Harris. But Pence, Trump's own vice president, didn't sound anything like President Trump. He could have been Ronald Reagan or George Bush's vice president. It was really a kind of return to normal Republican foreign policy. And so I guess I think that in 2024 that these candidates are going to return to more of a traditional conservative internationalist foreign policy, and that we're unlikely to see a return of Trumpism. So I guess I'm more optimistic about where we stand, but look forward to the discussion. So I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to ask you one brief question, and if everybody prepares to raise their hands or put their name in the Q&A, I am going to actually call on you to speak your questions. If you were advising the EU or the British government, and you were responding to this one-liner that we hear again and again and again in the last few weeks, which is how can Europe or the UK trust the United States, even with a President Biden after January 20th, since things could go back. And Corey, you might want to weigh in on this as well. How do we deal with this America that every 4 years is going to be either in the game or out of the game? What would your sort of brief response to that be? I guess this is a question for each of you, and then we'll come out to the audience.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. And in my role at the Atlantic Council, I do interact with European officials quite a bit. And I think that would have been a harder question to answer if Trump had won. And I did have conversations with European officials before the election. And I said, if Trump wins again, be patient with us. We'll get through this. But now that Biden has won, I think there is a clear sense of wanting to re-engage with allies. This is a priority issue. He's talked about having a summit of democracies in his first year. I suspect that one of his first overseas trips will be to Europe, maybe to Brussels, to express support for Europe and NATO. I think given the challenges that we face, especially the rise of China, it makes more sense for us to be working together. If it's the United States and China duking it out one-on-one, it's a tough position to be in. U.S. is something like 23% of global GDP, China 15%. That's a little too close for comfort. If you add in formal treaty allies, it's something like 59% of global GDP to China's 15%. So we're in a much stronger position. And I think that the officials in the Trump administration actually understood that from my conversations with people at policy planning, the State Department. Even Mike Pompeo this summer called for an alliance of democracies to deal with China. So I think we're good for 4 years. And then what's going to happen in 2024, as I just said, I suspect we're going to see not a return to Trumpism, even if it's an alum of the Trump administration like Pompeo or Pence. I think we're going to see, maybe I'm wish casting a little bit here, but I do think we'll see more of a return to a traditional Republican conservative internationalist approach to the world that values allies and recognizes that this is one of America's greatest strengths.
So my answer would be that, yes, of course, Britain should be worried about that, but it shouldn't newly be worried about that. It should always be worried about that, right? Like in the election of 1916, Woodrow Wilson had promised the American public he wouldn't get involved in the war in Europe. Franklin Roosevelt in the election of, 1940, does the exact same thing. And so it's always a struggle to get Americans to commit reliably, predictably to things in the outside world. But that's what leadership is for. So yeah, it's always hard. Matthew makes a good point about the enormous advantages that the United States gains by cooperation with its friends and allies. And I would emphasize how much the common values agenda really matters, that's the cement that holds America and its closest friends in unison, because it's impossible to imagine, for example, Britain reliably siding with China when the Chinese government puts 1 million Uyghur in concentration camps and marches the democracy protesters in Hong Kong off to jail yesterday. The values equation really is the foundation of cooperation. It's what draws us out into other people's problems.
Thank you for that. Of course, you raise an issue that might create some problems for joint, for collaboration and cooperation, but nonetheless, I'm going to turn to Sir David Melling for a question.
Well, thank you very much. And first, thanks to Corey and Matthew for a fascinating discussion. Could I take you back to the question of Trump himself? Do you think that he will run again, or is he simply positioning himself to maximize his influence in the next couple of years when he pursues other things? And could you say something about how much money he controls inside the Republican Party? And if he does decide not to run, but tries to make it into a dynastic enterprise, would that bring the Republican Party apart at the seams? I mean, will people settle for Donald Trump trying to impose the next candidate, even if it isn't him? Or do you think there will be a bloodbath over that? And the other thing is, we haven't touched tonight yet on what's going to happen in Georgia in January. And could you say a little bit about how you think the Republican Party is going to come out of that? Because it's obviously critical that for them, if they're to control the Senate, that they win those two by-elections. And what extent would it weaken Trump if by any chance they don't win those by-elections and actually the Senate does go to Biden?
Go ahead.
That's a great avalanche of questions, Sir David. Let me start with Georgia, because that is, I think, the most interesting of the questions. Stacey Abrams turned out Democratic voters in Georgia, Black voters, but not just Black voters in Georgia in numbers that have never been seen before. And I suspect that will even pick up momentum in the senatorial runoffs in January. So the good news is people are participating. They were able to remove barriers to people participating. And those are strong motivations on the Democratic side of the line. Neither Senator Perdue nor Senator Loeffler are deeply popular. And the corruption charges against both of them, but particularly Senator Perdue, look like they are getting some traction. But Republican senatorial candidates outperformed the president by a pretty significant margin. And so I wouldn't rule them out. What I would say that I noticed in the data about the presidential election is that the state races that drew a lot of outside money, in the way the Georgia election is drawing a lot of outside Democratic money, that money served to help Republicans, not the Democrats it was intended for, because it nationalized races that Democrats had stronger local, they had a stronger local case than they had a national case. I'm not sure that will hold in Georgia because the Senate hanging in the balance really is what's motivating Democrats there. One of the two candidates, Reverend Warwick, looks to be a really strong contender. The other slightly less so, but Perdue is also not very strong. So it's hard to predict what'll happen among two relatively weak candidates. On the question about President Trump and his children, I'm skeptical that once the president is, the belligerent drunk at the end of the bar, rather than having the ability to affect outcomes, that he will play such a dominant role. And what it looks to me like he is doing with the recount campaigns, if you look at the structure of the donations, 70% of it goes to the president personally. And so it looks to me like he's setting up his next grift, which is, a television channel, all Trump all the time. But one of the things the election shows is that Americans are growing weary of all Trump all the time. And the problem, the president, I am told, genuinely considered bouncing Mike Pence off of the ticket and putting his daughter on the ticket, and was persuaded by the pollsters that this would be an electoral disaster for him. So even though, as Lori Friedman pointed out when George W. Bush got elected, Americans actually kind of like political dynasties, right? That I'm not sure that will hold in the Trump administration, because Trump himself and his children are wholly uninterested in the challenges of governance.
Thank you. Matthew.
I'll just I agree with Corey. I'll just add a couple of points. I do think, there's kind of this norm that once you've gotten your party's nomination and either failed or become president, then that's it. You don't get a second bite at the apple. But Trump doesn't follow any other norms, so I don't know why he would abide by this one. So I think it's possible that he might want to try to run again in 2024, or even if not, he'll toy with the idea until 2024 to keep the spotlight on him. But I would hope that the party would learn its lesson from 2016. And there's the American political scientists who study party nomination process. The famous book was called The Party Decides. Actually, a colleague of mine at Georgetown, one of Leslie's old colleagues, was one of the co-authors of this. And it essentially says, yeah, there are these primary elections, but really it's the party elites in Washington who decide with their support and their fundraising. And then 2016, proved that model to be wrong with the Republican Party. And I think part of the problem is that there was just such a diversity of kind of mainstream Republican candidates. Remember, there were 16 candidates, that it left this lane for Trump to succeed. And, it's hindsight's 2020, but if Republicans had consolidated around somebody like Bush or Rubio or Cruz earlier, I think it might have been harder for Trump to have that lane. And so I think that's one lesson I take away from 2016, is that Republicans should consolidate around a mainstream candidate earlier on to prevent an outsider from taking the nomination. And then on, Don Jr. or Ivanka, I think, is another wild card. Don Jr. has written a couple of best-selling books now, was very active campaigning for his father. Trump clearly thinks Ivanka, his daughter, has political potential. So that is a wild card. We'll have to see how that plays out, but I would bet against it.
Okay, I hope that you're advising the Republican Party on that second point, that middle point that you made about consolidating earlier around a mainstream candidate. We have tremendous people on the list. So to manage everybody's expectations, we have 15 minutes, and we have Elena Lazarou, Lori Friedman, and Weena Morton, David Hannay, and George Robertson. I mean, we don't want to miss these questions. So I'm going to take them. I'm actually going to take 3. That's quite a lot given the people on the list. And I'm going to also remind you that one of our colleagues on the call has written in and asked about the future impact of the Murdochs and of Fox on the Republican Party. I have to say, I think that's a really interesting question. So keep that in your mind as well. We'll come first to you, Elena. if you
Thank
introduce.
you very much, Leslie. Good evening, everyone. I'm Elena Lazaru. I'm an associate fellow at Chatham House. I'm also Brussels-based. I work for the European Parliament's Research Service. So, very interesting to hear the conversation about transatlantic, but I'm going to try to avoid that one now because we're talking about the future of the Republican Party. So I'd be interested in hearing a bit about the internal thinking that's going on in the party, about the traditionally red states that have been lost, and to what extent that is attributed to, the odd event, or rather the one-time event of Biden versus Trump, two very specific candidates. This led to the Cindy McCains of Arizona. So is it a one-off event that the party thinks, is reversible? Or is this demographics, which is also a reason, and therefore there needs to be another strategy to re-win those states? So that's one thing. And then if I can make a sort of comment question, someone wrote in the chat, and they're absolutely right. Foreign policy has been mentioned a lot, and we are all around here. We know the traditional line, foreign policy doesn't matter that much in elections. But I wonder if Trump did something to make foreign policy a more salient personal issue for the electorate, and whether now that's something that perhaps we should keep in mind looking to the future. And I'll just leave that there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Laurie Friedman.
Very nice to see all my friends. At the moment, this sort of stab in the back theory is being created. Over here, what seems scary is the way that the whole legitimacy of an election is being directly challenged, and a whole load of Republicans, not quite the majority, but a good chunk of them, seem to buy into it. And these stab in the back theories have a habit of lingering. You can see in Georgia the argument that if the thing is rigged anyway, what's the point in voting? Which would be a somewhat ironic turn of events if it lost the Republicans the election. But I'm just it relates to the we haven't really mentioned. I've just been reading Obama's memoir on the rise of the Tea Party and so on. This is a grassroots movement that Trump tapped into, and it's still there, and votes in primaries. It's a lot of it seems pretty angry at the moment. So I just wonder whether your optimism, the good old-fashioned conservative Republicans can squash all this and find decent chaps to, because they all seem to be, apart from Nikki Haley, all seem to be chaps, that can come behind, underestimates what can happen in primaries, and the extent to which, even if Trump is just having his own radio shows or TV shows, whether he can energize that to remind people of just how badly he was treated by the system and how angry people should be about it.
I'm going to take one more question, but I will remind our audience that our panelists should be especially well positioned to answer that question, given that they've told us that their families voted, parts of their families, for President Trump. So, we're not talking about, we are talking about the Washington elite here, but we're also talking about two individuals who come from a part of America that really understands a part of America.
The point is, between the voters and the elite are the activists, and it's the activists I'm interested in.
Okay, but let me first, before you answer those two questions, because we do still have three, I'm going to take one more, come to you, and then come back out. Edwina Morton.
It was wonderful to hear reassuring points from both speakers, but some of us have spent the past 4 years watching the country that was the central pull to the international system, pulling the tent down. That damage is long lasting to confidence in the US and indeed in the Republican Party. The term Westlessness is a new word that many of us have been coming to grips with. Is the Republican Party remotely mindful of this? And the impact of this may be greater outside Europe than inside. There have been changes in Asia and the Middle East. The world that President Trump inherited is not the world that Biden or whoever succeeds him will face. Is there any recognition of that among the Republican Party? Any debate at all about that?
Thank you. Corey, shall I come to you again first?
Sure. No, Edwina, there's not much debate about that. We are so focused on our own internecine squabbles But I also don't think that's particularly new in American politics. It's never a winning political hand to say the world has expectations of you and behave like grown-ups, because Americans so seldom do. So I know there's no great recognition of that. What there is recognition of is what Elena raised, which is the Republican Party, after we lost in 2012, after Mitt Romney, as stable and thoughtful and big-minded and big-souled a Republican candidate as we've put up in forever, lost. The Republican National Committee did a study about what's it going to take for us to be able to win national elections. And the answers were big tent, stop the culture wars, actually govern the country well. And we proceeded in 2016 to nominate, and 2020 to nominate a candidate who did none of those things. And yet also won one presidential election and very nearly won two. So I think Lori's point about the activists being the intermediaries is actually really important. But there's also the structural factor that it used to be that you could in derisory terms talk about coastal elites. But if you look at the electoral map, the coasts are moving inward. You see the growth of Democratic support. I think Arizona is a special case that may have a lot to do with John McCain and his memory. But there are other states that flip, and what you see is the attitudes of coastal elites moving inward. To Lori's great question about primaries, you're right, that's the testing ground. A couple of important states now have no party primary. So in California, the top two vote getters of whatever party go to the general election, and that ameliorates it in some places. But it really is going to be interesting. I mean, that's the testing ground. Are Trumpian candidates what wins primaries? My guess is that the difference between people who turn up at rallies and what activists will support actually has a lot to do with whether you've got a policy agenda and able to achieve it. It goes back to Mac Thornberry, right? If you're solving people's problems, they are less interested in what's happening to a former president, and they're less interested in culture wars. So, I mean, it's crazy that my mom votes on energy policy or whatever nonsense my mom voted on, but solving people's problems continues to be the way you defang radicalism. As no less a source than Edmund Burke told us, right? That true religion is the way to win arguments that bring people out of superstition.
Thank you. Matthew?
I'll just add 2 quick points because I know we're running short on time. First, to Elena's question, think of the Republicans have taken some heart in the way Trump has overperformed expectations among some minority groups, including Hispanics in Florida. And, I think there was this sense among the Democrats that immigrants and minorities would always be Democratic voters. And there's this kind of hope among Republicans that as they, second generation, that these people will maybe become Republican voters over time, that they're not going to be on the left forever. And I think they see, rightly or wrongly, some evidence of that. And, they make the case that this really traditional Republican values of free markets, individual liberty should appeal to immigrants. It's why a lot of them come to the United States for the greater economic opportunity. And part of the reason Trump performed so well among Hispanics in Florida was by making the case, it's a campaign, so probably somewhat over the top, but that Democrats are socialists. You left Cuba, you left Venezuela because you wanted to get away from that. Do you really want to vote for a socialist? So I think that's part of how they're looking at some of the red states that they lost, that these immigrant and Hispanic voters might not be Democrats forever. We need to bring them into a multiracial Republican Party. Lori Friedman's question is great. I need to think about that a little bit more. It's a tough question. I don't have a great answer off the top of my head. On Westlessness, I think Corey's right that the party at large isn't thinking about it, but I think some conservative intellectual foreign policy thinkers are thinking about this. And I think this isn't just Trump pulling the tent down, but other trends as well. The rise of China, populism across the West. I think there are a lot of strains on the kind of post-Cold War international order. And so some people are thinking about how do we revitalize and adapt this system for a new era.
I'm going to come to David Hannay and then George Robertson. I think I just want to insert one thing. It's interesting as we're talking to immigrant groups. I don't think we've mentioned the Asian Americans, which are a really interesting group as well. I think the support for the Democrats came down a bit in this election, but it's a very wealthy group, and so it will be interesting to see if there's anything to play for there. Not least with Nikki Haley and Kamala Harris, both being females who can kind of speak in an identity aspect to that demographic. But David Hannay, let me come to you.
Yeah, I wonder if our two splendid commentators who have restored some of my incurable optimism would comment on whether they think that Donald Trump's legal travails, of which there seem to be quite a number, are going to affect the issues we've all been talking about this evening, i.e. his viability in the future, that of his children and so on. I mean, when we actually get to see his tax returns, are Americans going to be upset? You bet your bottom dollar that Brits would be upset, but are Americans going to be upset if they see that basically they had a crook in the White House?
George Robertson?
What I was going to say is when the dust settles on January the 20th, the biggest problem that will face America is not going to be in foreign policy terms. It's going to be COVID, which is running out of control, and an escalating size of the deficit that is going to be the consequence of it. So is the Republican Party going to buckle down on a joint basis to deal with this horrible, horrible disease that is costing lives and money in the United States?
A very tough question. And I'm going to invite each of you to respond to those questions, but also to give any closing remarks that you might wish to. I think we could do this for another hour. So I think we're going to have a part two sometime after the inauguration when we learn more. But over to you, Corey.
So to answer Sir David Hannay's question, the president's very likely to go to prison for tax evasion. One of the lesser noticed things that the Mueller investigation did was farm out elements of the investigation to state prosecutors, and presidents have no ability to issue pardons for state crimes, and states have a great interest in tax collection. So if I were the president, if I were the president's children, I would be really worried about the Southern District of New York going through my business records, because there appears to be the basis for considerable litigation there. And yes, I do think that the president, it will add to the stab in the back theory. The deep state went after him. But also there's, even Americans think people should pay their taxes from time to time. They especially think rich people should pay their taxes. And to Lord Robertson of Port Ellen's great challenge, I do think President Trump would have been reelected, but for the economic consequences of COVID and his manifest unwillingness to do anything useful about it. I think the Biden administration took that message and is moving forward. I also think it's likely that the Biden administration will give Republicans a lifeline of wanting to solve the problem on a bipartisan basis. I do think Biden's actually quite sincere about his belief about reuniting the country, and that's the obvious way to do it. And it will buy Biden goodwill for getting legislation through Congress. You can see already Republicans returning to being deficit hawks now that it's not a Republican president who's spending the money that none of us have. But I think it's significant the way Mitt Romney phrased it yesterday, which is, of course, we need a plan for debt reduction, but the middle of the pandemic is not the time to be cutting social welfare payments because people are suffering and we need to help. You know, this is what government's actually for.
Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll just end by answering a question that you raised on Twitter today. Actually, Leslie, I don't know if you remember, but you said you want to ask, is there the hope for bipartisanship with a Biden foreign policy with Republicans in Congress? And I've been pretty optimistic so far, so maybe I'll end with just a dose of pessimism. Because I was talking to some Senate Republicans who said, you know, we hope that Biden is sincere about his desire to have a bipartisan foreign policy. But it's up to him if he comes into office and immediately re-enters Paris, immediately re-enters the Iran deal without consulting with us. We're going to see that as a sign that he's going his own way. You know, maybe we'll give him Paris, but that for the Iran deal, he should really consult with us. This was part of the problem with Obama's approach, not getting bipartisan support in Congress. And so I raised that issue with a colleague of mine who was working on the Biden foreign policy team for the campaign. I think this person's likely to get a position. And he said, well, if they see that as a litmus test, that's a real problem because the Iran deal is not about us and Republicans in Congress. This is about our international commitments. Of course, we want to try to re-enter the deal as soon as possible. So we may be then in for a more partisan polarization when it comes to foreign policy, if that's the case.
Thank you, and thank you for taking that on. I think you have just sent a feeling, I would imagine, of slight terror through our 75 people who are on the call at 7 p.m. On a dark, almost winter's night here in the UK, on the day in which the UK is claiming a national victory in, getting the vaccination. That's an American and German and vaccination through. But so there's room for optimism. There's room for pessimism. I think when we hear you talk about, that things might not go the way that we want, and when we hear you say the word climate, I think we all get nervous because we all know that's the challenge of our time. And I think many people here in the UK feel like it does hinge on the Republicans to a degree. And of course, on America and on China, all of these really tough issues. But you've given us incredible food for thought in a really granular way. And I appreciate your willingness to talk with us far beyond the things that we usually insist you talk about, China, deterrence, the Middle East, Corey, Iran, Matthew, and any number of issues. We will have you back to talk more about this and more about that if you will say yes. And thank you to all of you who asked great questions. We'll return to all of this very soon. If you unmute and give our panel, our speakers a big round of applause, that would be great. Thank you.